What is game theory? What is game theory in politics? Game theory or gaming is where someone engineers a particular outcome in a pre-calculated manner. This can be applied to mathematics, and in mathematical modelling, game theory is undertaken. In the Australian context, gaming has been most famously applied by Glenn Jury, the so-called preference whisperer, who's been able to engineer the election of a raft of senators from micro-parties by engineering the exchange of preferences. To apply game theory, one can either have a conscious understanding of what gaming is, or an intuitive understanding. For some of those who have a conscious understanding of game theory or of gaming, have actually studied the works of Jane Austen, the 19th century novelist, who intuitively had an understanding of gaming. Indeed, it's been those who've done studies of gaming have studied Jane Austen and seen how her books are riddled with this phenomenon. Most of you have probably read the Jane Austen novel Pride and Prejudice, and you might recall the character Mrs. Bennet, who sends her daughter Jane on horseback in the rain over to the Bingleys, calculating that Jane will have to stay overnight at the Bingleys. And much to Mrs. Bennet's delight, Jane actually catches a cold. And in catching a cold, she has to stay overnight and convalesce for an extended period. Therefore, Mrs. Bennet gains the belief that Jane and Mr. Bingley are going to become married, and thinking that they are engaged, boasts that with Jane married to Mr. Bingley, she'll ensure that her sisters meet other wealthy suitors. This is a manifestation of game theory. And someone who applied either intuitively or consciously game theory was Fidel Castro in 1941. In August of that year, Cuba was profoundly shocked when the opposition presidential candidate, Senator Eddie Chivas, suicided when he was unable to substantiate allegations of corruption. This led to an outpouring of revulsion against corruption within the Cuban political system. And Fidel Castro moved into the void to make credible charges of corruption against the then president, Prio Soares. And Castro therefore engineered a situation where Soares, in order to avoid the election of the opposition to power and his own prosecution, went into an alliance with Fulgencio Batista, a covert alliance whereby Fulgencio Batista, a former Cuban president, returned to power in a military coup in March 1952. But although Fulgencio Batista owed his return to power to Fidel Castro's machinations, Castro had done Batista no favours. For out of Batista's return to power, Castro then sought to engineer a situation where by 1958 a majority of the Cuban population, perhaps as high as 70%, were opposed to President Batista because they believed he's having returned to power by a military coup, that he was a dictator who could only be removed by force. And as a result, the Cuban people gave their support to Fidel Castro in a tragic action. But what is tragedy? Tragedy, a definition of tragedy, is to destroy something that someone tries to build. And the Cuban people did this on the erroneous assumption that Fulgencio Batista was a dictator and that Fidel Castro was a democrat. For Castro, on coming to power in January 1959, would move to establish a totalitarian dictatorship, a communist dictatorship that lasts to this day in Cuba. To have an understanding of how Castro did this, you first have to have an understanding of Cuban history. And I would date the commencement of modern Cuban history as beginning in 1895, when the poet and the spiritual father of the Cuban nation, Jose Marti, returned from his American exile to launch what indeed turned out to be a suicidal revolt against Spanish rule, for Marti in the process would lose his life. Cuba at this time was different from others Latin American countries, and that its achievement of independence from Spain was 70 years delayed. This was because there was a substantial expatriate Spanish population in Cuba that still retained ties to the homeland. And the American intervention in the Cuban War of Independence in 1898, which resulted in Spain losing control of Cuba, was a trauma for many Spaniards. And indeed, the United States intervention in 1898 would also become a trauma for many Cubans. And it's been said that it's something that's yet to be fully exercised from the Cuban psyche. For the United States was to take control of Cuba at the point at which it was to become independent. And if I may now, for a moment, come across as a little bit of a lefty, though I'm not, contrary to rumour, between 1899 and 1902, Cuba was controlled by the United States, occupied by America. And during this period, American business interests displaced those of the Spanish. But nevertheless, Cuba passed the paradigm. For May 1902, the United States granted Cuban independence. But this independence was qualified by what became known as the Platt Amendment. And Cuba, between 1902 and 1934, was a period in which Cuba was known as the Platt Republic, in which the United States had the supposed right to intervene in Cuban domestic affairs to protect American citizens and investment properties in Cuba. And it was an action of goodwill on the part of President Roosevelt in May 1934. The Platt Amendment was abrogated, and with that, Cuba gained full independence. Under the Platt Republic, the so-called Platt Republic, a two-party system developed between the Havana-based Liberal Party and the anti-Havana Conservative Party, which later, following the 1933 revolution, went through various metamorphoses, and by the time that Castro came to power in 1958, was known as the Democratic Party. A pattern developed whereby the party which lost an election would stage a revolt in order to precipitate American intervention. And this sense of frustrated nationalism, which also included unrest against Cuba's African minority, led to the election in November 1924 of Gerardo Machado, a successful businessman and an independence, a hero of the War of Independence. Machado unfortunately went on to establish Cuba's first undiluted dictatorship. That is not to say that the Machado regime did not have its successes. It secured the transfer of the Isle of Pines, from American to Cuban sovereignty, and Machado inaugurated a vast and unprecedented public works program. But alas, Machado was corrupt, and he saw that cronies within his Liberal Party and corporate elements within the Conservative Party were enriched. And this regime might have lasted indefinitely if it was not for the onset of the Great Depression in 1929, which saw the collapse of sugar prices. And in September 1930 saw the outbreak of riots instigated by the Student Directorate. And between 1930 and 1933, Cuba was plunged into a vicious subterranean civil war with a myriad of opposition groups, the most prominent of which were the Student Directory and the ABC. And in July 1933, opposition to Machado had coalesced that he was obliged to resign and flee into exile. A new government was subsequently established by the respected Carlos Cepades. But on the 4th of September 1933, in the Columbia Army Barracks in Havana, a mutiny amongst non-commissioned officers broke out. And control of this mutiny soon passed to a sergeant named Fulgencio Batista Saldivar, who, by linking up with the Student Directory, soon took over government. Fulgencio Batista was born in January 1901 in Oriente province, which was then Cuba's poorest province, and he was born into a poor family, as his father was an itinerant cane cutter. The big break that Fulgencio Batista had in his life was that he went to a Quaker missionary school, where he learned to read and write. And his history teacher, an American Quaker missionary, instilled with Batista a lifelong admiration, if not obsession with, Abraham Lincoln. And Batista sought to emulate Abraham Lincoln's story of being born in a shack and subsequently moving to the White House, into a log cabin, and subsequently moving eventually to the White House. Batista was inspired by Lincoln, and a paradox of Fulgencio Batista's life was, had he been born into a wealthy or to a middle-class family, I don't think he would have kept on pushing himself forward. And even following his fall from power in 1959, Batista always sought to improve his situation, no matter how difficult it may be. Batista gained a job with the railways in 1919, and with that took himself out of the confines of Oriente province. And in 1921, as a private, joined the Cuban army. He undertook a stenographer's course, and in 1928 topped his sergeant exams. And in 1931 was employed as a court stenographer at the army barrack, in the Columbia Army Barracks, where he was a stenographer for trials of political opponents of Machado. And this gave him a unique insight into Cuban politics, who the political personalities were, and what the factional dynamics were, which would help him later emerge from obscurity to master an array of complex circumstances. Batista would later say that he actually planned his own revolution in 1933, and the events overtook him with Machado's fall. Nevertheless, Batista mastered control of the 4th of September revolt and linked up, as I said before, with the student directory to ensure that Professor Raymond Grau San Martin became provisional president of Cuba in September 1933. Grau San Martin came across as a man of integrity, and he had a myopic, scholarly persona. But this actually belied the fact that Grau was actually a deeply cynical and manipulative character. And later, with regard to his second government in the 1940s, the excesses of which would help ensure that Fidel Castro came to power. But this was not to be known at the time. Grau, on becoming president of Cuba, refused to swear allegiance to the Constitution, and in doing so, transmitted his opposition to the Platt Amendment. Indeed, the existence of the Grau government between September 1933 and January 1934 constituted a declaration of full Cuban independence, as the Grau government was unrecognised by Washington. During this period, Grau had to contend with 2 aborted military revolts, which were crushed by Batista. And in January 1934, Grau moved to resign the presidency. This action is still misunderstood even by anti-communist Cubans to this day. It's often been portrayed that Batista moved against Grau, deposed him, and in doing so betrayed the aspirations of the 1933 revolution. But in actual fact, Grau resigned of his own volition because he was coming under attack within his own political base, the student directory, from his known rival within that organisation, Eddie Chibas. And Grau resigned, blaming imperialist forces. Grau intended and achieved the generation of a wave of public sympathy for him. And before resigning, Grau had scheduled elections to a constituent assembly in April 1934. And in February, his supporters formed their own party, the Cuban Revolutionary Party, which later went by the name of the Authentico Party. Grau probably would have returned to power by the ballot box, but after 3 provisional presidents in 5 days, the presidency, with Fulgencio Batista's support, passed to a Carlos Mendenta, who was the leader of an anti-Machado Liberal Party breakaway party, the National Union. And it was Mendenta who took matters into his own hands by cancelling to the 1933 revolution. And it was due to Grau's popularity that one of his adherents, Antonio Guterres, who had served as interior minister under Grau, and Guterres was an American-born, half American and virulently anti-American man, took advantage of a teachers' strike in March 1935, you have to watch those teachers, to try and launch a revolution. The army under Batista's command crushed this revolt, and in the process, Guterres was shot dead in a shootout with government forces. Again, this has led into a narrative that Batista again betrayed the revolution of 1933 by crushing a revolt. But had Guterres succeeded, he undoubtedly would have established his own dictatorship. And once you compare Batista's actions in his early years of power with Fidel Castro, when Fidel Castro came to power in 1959, there was a strong expectation that in the second half of 1959, elections would be held. Castro instead announced that elections would be held in 2 years' time, in 1961. But when it came around to 1961, Fidel Castro cynically cancelled any elections and began to establish a one-party state, cynically declaring that every day in Cuba was a general election. Fidel Castro, Fulgencio Batista, by contrast, came to power when he first began his ascent to power in 1933, was presented with an array of complex problems, but nevertheless did what he could to ensure that general elections were held in January 1936. And Batista helped put together a pro-government coalition called the Tripartite Coalition, which included Machado's old Liberal Party. These elections were held and won by Miguel Gomez, and he assumed the presidency in May 1936. But Gomez and Batista did not get along, and in December 1936, Batista instigated Gomez's removal as president by congressional impeachment. And with that, the presidency passed to his vice president, Leonardo Bru. President Bru, between 1936 and 1940, cooperated with Batista. And this period, even some of Batista's harshest critics have conceded, was a time of positive achievement for him. During this time, Batista undertook an array of social reforms. Batista, having been able to break out of poverty because he was able to learn how to read and write, was determined that all Cubans, regardless of their background, be literate. So he therefore ordered army officers, many of whom were former NCOs, out into the countryside to teach what became known as rural civic schools. And by the time of Castro's rise to power in 1958, in part because of Batista's literacy program, 80% of the Cuban population was literate. Batista, having had a brother who died from tuberculosis, also ensured that the anti-tuberculosis clinics were constructed throughout Cuba. And having his father suffered from precarious employment, Batista ensured that cane cutters who worked in sugarcane fields were granted a minimum wage and employment security. Batista, in this period, also had a law passed which stipulated that all employees, even if employed by American-owned businesses, had to at least 50% be Cuban employed. And Batista probably introduced the world's first affirmative action legislation, which stipulated that 70% of employees in the textile sector had to be female. And Batista also cultivated during this period links with organised labour. But the March 1938 congressional elections and the high abstention rate was reflective that many Cubans still remained loyal to the exiled Grau. Batista accordingly allowed Grau to return to Cuba in 1938, and elections to a Constituent Assembly were held in November 1939 to draw up a new constitution. Remarkably, Grau's party, Auténticos, won a plurality of the vote despite being under-resourced. And the ruling National Union Party fell by the wayside, with the Macadoista Liberal Party surprisingly coming a strong second, with the old Conservative Party, now known as the Republican Democratic Party, coming third. Batista gained great kudos by accepting these seemingly adverse results, and the Constituent Assembly proceeded to draw up a new constitution, the Constitution of 1940, which was undoubtedly the preeminent achievement of pre-totalitarian Cuba. The Constitution of 1940 made provision for election of a president to a 4-year term, who was banned from succeeding himself for a period of 8 years. I'd like to at this stage say that if the 1940 Constitution in a post-totalitarian democratic Cuba is ever reinstated in the future, that I would like to see a Cuban president serve a 6-year term instead of a 4, because the challenges that he or she would face would be colossal. And I'd also like to see, similar to the Mexican Constitution, a stipulation that anyone elected to the presidency be banned from ever again seeking the presidency. The 1940 Constitution also made provision for a semi-parliamentary system with the creation of the post of Prime Minister. This Constitution also made provision for collective bargaining and granted extensive labour rights. With the promulgation of this Constitution, Batista was faced with the prospect and the challenge of defeating Grau in the ensuing presidential elections in May 1940. This was done by Batista forming a 5-party coalition, which curiously went by the name of the Democratic Socialist Coalition. Despite this avowed centre-left orientation, the two major parties of this coalition were the old Macadoista Liberal Party and the old Conservative Party, now known as the Republican Democratic Party. This title was probably adopted because it involved the membership of the Cuban Communist Party, which from 1943 was known as the Populist Popular Socialist Party. Batista was able to legitimately win the presidency in 1940 and serve as a constitutional president between 1940 and 1944. The major issue that confronted Batista was during his first constitutional presidency was that of the United States' entry into the Second World War. And with that came an increase in demand for sugar, so that Cuba came out of the throes of the Great Depression. Cuba accordingly declared war on the Axis in December 1941 following the bombing of Pearl Harbor. However, no Cuban army units went to fight in the Second World War, but American army units composed of volunteers did see action. Due to the prosperity that came in this era, there was a general question as to who would succeed Batista when he retired from office in 1944. The man that Batista chose to succeed him was Raul Rodriguez, a former leader of the ABC party who had broken with his party to support Batista's election to the presidency in 1940. Rodriguez served as Prime Minister of Cuba between 1940 and 1942, and he did so with an unblemished reputation for honesty. And therefore, had he won the presidency in 1944, he undoubtedly would have provided honest government. But alas, the 1944 presidential election was to be won by Grau. This upset election victory can be attributed not only to Grau's popularity, but also to the political genius of a Cuban figure who's been relatively unexamined, that of Glomerio Alonso Pujol. Glomerio Alonso, until the rise of Fidel Castro in the 1950s, was arguably Cuba's smartest politician. He was a stalwart of the old Conservative Party, and in 1942 split from the Republican Democratic Party to form the Republican Party. And Alonso helped hive off enough of the old Conservative Party vote to ensure the election of Grau San Martin to the presidency in 1944. If there was to be any period in Cuban history in which there were failed expectations, it was to be the ensuing 8 years of Authentico Party rule, which were, to everyone's surprise, to be amongst the most corrupt that Cuba had experienced. This corruption can be derived from two factors. One was Grau's cynical personality. This bachelor president was often fond of saying that I cannot be bought, but if you want something, see Pauline, which was in reference to his sister-in-law, who was the regime's first lady and its bag lady, and it was Pauline who accepted bribes and who extorted money. The other reason that the Authentico Party was so corrupt was because this party had emerged from the student directory, which was based at Havana University. In 1937, a university autonomy law had been passed, which established a specialised court at the university. So if a murder or some other crime was committed on the grounds of Havana University, it would be tried by this court and not by the regular courts. The only problem with this setup was that this court did not function. So therefore, the University of Havana became a cesspool for corruption and crime. And as a result, two ostensible political groups, the so-called Socialist Revolutionary Movement, whose only political component was its anti-communism, and the Insurrectional Revolutionary Union, the UAL, which Fidel Castro later joined in the 1940s, engaged and in times vicious turf war for control of the student union of the university. And in September 1945, the respective heads of the MSR and the UAL were made police chiefs. So the scenario came whereby, the lunatics took control of the asylum, and corruption, gangster-generated violence began to permeate all aspects of Cuban society. There was a breakdown of law and order. Grau also showed himself to be dedicated to trying to hold on to power, and in 1947 tried unsuccessfully to amend the constitution so that he could seek a second term. This precipitated a split within the Authentico Party, with Grau's main rival, Eddie Chivas, splitting from this party to form the Cuban People's Party, which later became popularly known as the Orthodoxo Party. And so it was that, the fact that over 10 years later, following the 1948 presidential elections, that Fidel Castro's phantom guerrilla force was able to take power and establish a totalitarian dictatorship would be reflected by the results the voting patterns of the 1948 presidential elections. In these elections, Grau's anointed candidate, Prio Socrates, who had formerly served as a Labour minister and a Prime Minister, became the Authentico Party running mate, presidential candidate. His running mate was none other than Guillermo Alonso, the leader of the Republican Party. But despite the administration-backed tickets' patronage capacity, it only garnered 35% of the vote. The runner-up in the election was a Dr. Luis Procundio of the Liberal Party, and he'd entered into an alliance with the Democratic Party, so the coalition called the Liberal Democratic Coalition was formed, and this ticket garnered 22% of the vote. Then the flamboyant Eddie Chibas came third with 11% of the vote, and this reflected his personal following, but not that amongst too much of Cuban society being wary of Chibas. Indeed, there was a joke about Chibas that one politician said of him: "We're all corrupt. The only one who isn't is Eddie Chibas, and he's loco." And the candidate that came forth was the communist candidate Juan Manrelio. But in actual fact, there were actually 5 candidates that ran in the 1948 elections. Well, there was the unofficial candidacy of Senor Blanc Ballot, who came third with over 20% of the vote. But nevertheless, there was a transition from one democratically elected government to the next. And Batista, who at this time was exiled to the United States, to Daytona in Florida, was elected to the Senate as a candidate of the Liberal Democratic Coalition, and accordingly returned to Cuba. A closer examination of Batista's activities between 1948 and 1952 would indicate that he was actually a political pawn of Vice President Alonso. And it was Vice President Alonso's master plan to appropriate Batista's political base and take it into the Authentico Party so the Vice President could establish his own base within the ruling party and undertake the process of converting this party into being a conventional centre-right party. But Batista was not to know this. And paradoxically, part of the process of appropriating Batista's base was Batista to move to solidify this base. And in March 1949, Batista founded his own political party, the Partido Acción Unitaria, the Unitary Action Party, or the PUAY. This party, which in 1952, at the time of Batista's return to power, had over 250,000 members, which was substantial for a population of 5 million, drew members from the Liberal Party, the Democratic Party, and even from the Communist Party, the 3 main parties of the previously ruling Democratic Socialist Coalition. This party, as I said, was a centrist political party. It endorsed the social reforms that Batista had undertaken in the 1930s and 1940s, but was somewhat to the right of centre, and that that in keeping with Batista's outlook was a strong defender of private property rights, as Batista was opposed to both nationalisation and to land reform. This new fledgling party went into its baptism of fire when mid-term and congressional elections were held in 1950. And it's with regard to these elections that Vice President Alonso began to ensnare his trap of Fulgencio Batista. In January 1950, President Prio passed over the acting mayor of Havana, Nicolas Castellanos, to be the ruling party's mayoral candidate. In actual fact, Prio chose his brother Daniel, who had actually scandalously and corruptly served as finance minister. Castellanos accordingly broke or supposedly broke with the president and joined Batista's PUAY. And the Republican Party, led by Vice President Alonso, accordingly also apparently broke with the ruling party. And minority factions within the Liberal and the Democratic parties also rallied to support Castellanos' candidacy, as did a minority faction within the Authentico Party, led by former President Grau San Martin. This alliance became known as the Concurrence, or the Cubanidad Alliance. And despite an at times violent election campaign, Castellanos was successfully elected mayor of Havana in June 1950. And this victory was made all the sweeter for Batista, as his brother was as the alliance candidate, elected as governor of Havana province. And Batista, in December 1950, declared his candidacy for president. But as I said, he was actually working within a paradigm in which he was manipulated. For in February 1951, probably at the instigation of Vice President Alonso, Mayor Castellanos announced the formation of his own political party, the Cuban National Party, or the PCN. And in April of that year, Grau also split from the ruling party to found his own political party, the Cubanidad Party, which promoted the presidential candidacy of Grau's nephew, Pepe Grau San Martin. And an arrangement probably devised by Vice President Alonso, the leader of these three parties, came to an agreement that in the first quarter of 1952 they would hold a mega convention, which would include delegates from the Liberal and Democratic parties, whereby based on the number of members each party had within this coalition, delegates would be apportioned. So therefore a competition between the leaders of the PCN, the PUE and the Cubanidad Party ensured, in which they tried to recruit more members to see who would win the nomination in 1952. But in November 1951, and again, probably as part of a master plan on the part of Vice President Alonso, the Authentico Party convened in November and nominated Carlos Hevia, who was then serving as Foreign Minister, and his glaring point of attraction was he was about the only apparently senior Authentico Party official. At this convention, the PCN Party, along with the Republicans, coalesced and entered into the Authentico Party ranks. And this seemed to undermine Batista's capacity to run as a coalition candidate in 1952. Batista responded to this by convening a convention of his own party, the PUE, in January 1952, which did not, I must emphasise, nominate him for president, but rather affirming his party president, as Batista still intended to attend a convention with the Cubanidad Party and factions of the Liberal and Democratic Party that would not align to the Authentico Party. But in January of 1952, factions within the Liberal and Democratic parties moved to integrate themselves with the Authentico Party, and in February, Grau reunited his party with the Authenticos. And in that same month, Batista's own brother, Francisco Batista, who was governor of Havana, broke with his brother and defected to the Authenticos. And it seemed that the only course of action now for Batista was to abort his presidential candidacy and have his party enter the Authentico Party. And with Carlos Hevia having this backing of his coalesced forces, and considering the public wariness towards Eddie Chivas, it seemed predestined that the Authentico Party would win the June elections. But alas, fate was to intervene, and Batista and Castro, at different times I've confused Batista and Castro, I don't mean to insult Batista when I do that, but alas, Fidel Castro was to intervene and take advantage of new circumstances as part of his application of game theory. In August 1951, Eddie Chivas made allegations of corruption against the corrupt Minister for Education, Sanchez Arango, which he was unable to substantiate, and so therefore, on a public radio broadcast, Chivas fatally wounded himself by shooting himself. And as a result of this, there was an outpouring of not only of grief, but also disgust towards corruption within the Cuban political system. I'd like to say at this juncture that Batista was corrupt. He did, during his time as a strong man and his two presidencies, siphon off funds for public works programs to enrich himself. But this was a practice that nearly all Cuban governments, going back to the Spanish colonial era, had undertaken. And Batista, in contrast to other presidents, always completed these public works programs. And it should be said that the Batista regime was nowhere near as corrupt as the Macardo regime or the two Authentico parties, let alone the Castro regime, as Fidel Castro has been named by Forbes magazine as being one of the world's top 100 wealthiest people. But it was Castro who took advantage of Eddie Chivas' suicide to apply a game theory. And at this time, Castro, who was a young lawyer and prospective congressional candidate with the Orthodoxo Party, made credible charges of corruption against President Prio. And it seems that in September of 1951, Castro actually met with Fulgencio Batista at his Coquin estate and put it to the former president that he return to power. In this period between September 1951 and March of 1952, credible allegations derived from from Castro's investigations of corruption against President Prijo were made and publicised in the Batistano newspaper Alerta. Castro, who has a very logical mind, correctly calculated that this would frighten President Prijo, who was now faced with the prospect of the Orthodoxo party led by Roberto Agramonte winning office, into scaring the president into aborting the presidential elections. But Castro knew that Prijo firstly could not rig the elections because of the protections of the 1943 electoral code, and also could not suspend the constitution, for to have done so would have been to have generated a revolution from below. But Castro did realise that Prijo, by going into alliance with Fulgencio Batista, a covert alliance with Batista, could abort the elections by Batista returning to power in a military coup. And in February 1952, Castro positioned himself outside, at night time, outside Batista's Coquin estate, as he watched delegated with binoculars delegations of army officers making their way to Batista's estate. This wasn't so much prescience on Castro's part as it reflected that he'd actually engineered a situation which he was checking out to see what was going to occur of Prijo arranging with Batista for the latter to stage a coup. And thus the coup came on the 10th of March 1952, which was staged within a record of 77 minutes. The fact that there was such an easy seizure of power was not so much a seizure of power, but rather a transfer of power from one president to the next. And with Batista having taken power, Prijo departed into exile. And as part of an undoubted deal done between the two men, Prijo was allowed to hold on to his properties and so on, and would be allowed later to re-enter Cuban politics, electoral politics. With the success of the coup, and Batista, if you play chess, you know that if a pawn makes it to the other side of the board, it becomes a queen. Batista had in effect had been a pawn who made it to the other side of the board. Batista, with the success of his coup, met with Raul Rodriguez, his most prestigious supporter, to offer him the provisional presidency of Cuba. It was Batista's initial plan